Metal Gear Solid has a lot to say about deterrence and how effective it is, or isn't. Let's take a look at how the idea of deterrence is tackled throughout Metal Gear Solid. Welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Luffy and welcome to my channel. I talk video games and character analysis, so if that's your thing, subscribe and stick around. Heads up, this video will have spoilers for Metal Gear Solid 1, Metal Gear Solid 3, and Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker. Also, this conversation is all within the context of the world of Metal Gear Solid. Obviously, these events didn't happen in real life, or did they? No, they didn't. We're talking about deterrence in relation to Metal Gear Solid, not the real world. What is deterrence? Deterrence is the action of discouraging an action or event through instilling doubt or fear of the consequences. In Metal Gear Solid, deterrence usually takes the form of nuclear weapons and Metal Gears. A villain tries to set up a sick new base for themselves and threatens opposing governments with a nuclear strike from their Metal Gear if their demands aren't met. Metal Gear Solid 3, a nuclear strike that isn't met with retaliation. 1964, smack dab in the middle of the Cold War. What do you do when you don't want to take a swing at someone, but you want to intimidate the heck out of them to make sure they don't try to take a swing at you? How do you prove you're a terrifying force to reckon with without putting on a display of your power? You stockpile nukes. The Cold War was a war of deterrence. The US and the Soviet Union engaged in an arms race where both stockpiled as many nukes as possible. The thought was that the country with the most nukes was the safest. If you nuke me once, I'll nuke you 3 times. No one wants to be nuked 3 times, or once. In MGS3, Soviet GRU Colonel Volgin was gifted an American-made nuke by a high-ranking military officer who was seemingly defecting to the Soviet Union. Volgin wasn't interested in the tensions between his home country and the United States, and recklessly fired his own nuke at a Soviet research facility, uncaring of any potential consequences for the world at large. The fact that the nuke was American-made and was put in the hands by an American soldier placed the blame on the US for the strike. How did the Soviet Union react? Did they immediately return fire and nuke a US research facility? No, they didn't. Instead, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev calls the president of the US, Lyndon B. Johnson, to work out a solution. Khrushchev didn't want to fire back at the US. Both he and President Johnson knew that meant all-out nuclear war. His response begs the question, are all those nukes they stockpiled really working as a deterrent, or are they just a dangerous pile of weapons? Reasonably, no one wants to face nuclear war or to even drop another singular nuke, so why do we have so many stockpiled? If the US had 0 nukes on hand, then the government wouldn't have had a nuke for Volgin to have been gifted. Sure, he may have gotten his hands on a different kind of American-made weapon and used it to destroy the Soviet research facility, but they wouldn't have gotten nuked. I'm not advocating for nuclear weapons to be used in retaliation to a nuclear strike, but what's the point of the Soviet Union in having nukes if they're not going to make good on their promise to return nuclear fire? Again, if the US didn't have nukes, Volgin never would have gotten the opportunity to launch a nuclear strike on a Soviet research facility. And if both the US and the Soviet Union didn't stockpile nuclear weapons, there would be no nuclear Armageddon to worry about. You don't have to worry about a nuclear World War III if no one has nuclear weapons to begin with. Nuclear deterrence in MGS3 is nothing more than theater. Even with a nuclear strike, neither side is willing to use their nukes. Why have nukes stockpiled then? Disarm and dismantle the nukes. What did you think at the end of MGS3 though? Did you think the nuclear deterrent worked for both sides? Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker. Nuclear deterrence tested. After the debacle that was the Virtuous mission in MGS3, where an American-made nuke was used against Soviet territory, Hot Cold Man is disillusioned with the idea that people would be willing to pull the trigger on a nuclear strike if necessary. And as we asked before, what good is a deterrent if you aren't willing to use it? Hot Coldman felt the solution would be to turn the management of the US's nuclear deterrent over to a machine. A machine wouldn't hesitate to return nuclear fire. Hot Coldman headed the development of Metal Gear Peace Walker in Costa Rica. Peace Walker was a mobile, fail-deadly, nuclear deterrent system capable of striking from anywhere. Hot Coldman believed Peace Walker was the key to true peace. In order to prove his belief, Coldman activated Peace Walker and transmitted false trajectory data to NORAD to force the US military to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike. Coldman believed that no one at NORAD had the stomach to launch a retaliatory nuke, and that his falsified scenario would prove to them that they needed a machine at the ready to launch retaliatory strikes for them. Unfortunately, the Joint Chiefs proved Coldman wrong when they decided to launch a nuke in retaliation based on the strike data they were receiving. Does the Joint Chiefs making good on their promise of nuclear retaliation mean nuclear deterrence works, though? As far as the NORAD command was concerned, the vast amount of nukes that they possessed wasn't actually enough to prevent this attack from happening. From their perspective, Their arsenal didn't prevent the strike, and they simply proved their willingness to follow through on the promise of mutually assured destruction. Regardless of whether or not the strike data was real, the retaliatory strike would thrust the two superpowers involved into a nuclear war. If Coldman's intentions was to show that the US was too weak to actually retaliate in the case of an actual nuclear attack, and therefore were undermining the logic of deterrence, then he was proved wrong. But did his actions and the actions of the US military show anything about the overall philosophy of deterrence? Do you think the Joint Chiefs were right in retaliating? Metal Gear Solid 5, Power to the Player. In MGS5, we're given control over our own slice of outer heaven. It's our responsibility to invest into our base to build it up to something that can support our troops. The bigger our base grows, however, the more resources it accumulates, and the more attention it draws. Other players want to get their hands on the resources your base has stockpiled. How do we prevent other players from stealing from your hard-earned base? Nuclear deterrence. MGS5 makes deterrence personal. In MGS5, you can develop nukes for your base, and if you do develop a nuke, you get the Deterrence achievement. The nuke works as a deterrent too, as only players that have the Hero achievement can attack your base and potentially steal your nuke. Players can only achieve the Hero achievement by earning 150,000 Hero points, though if you develop a nuke, you lose 50,000 Hero points. Is stockpiling nukes in MGS5 true deterrence though? You don't have an option to launch a nuke at a base that's raided yours in retaliation. Nukes just prevent players without the right qualifications from raiding you. Deterrence in MGS5 is an immovable gameplay mechanic, not a moral dilemma you have to grapple with. It would have been more effective had any player, regardless of status, been able to raid a base with a nuke, but the player with a nuke had the choice to launch the nuke at the offending player's base. Maybe players with the hero status would have anti-nuke missiles or something to give them an advantage back, and make a player with a nuke's deterrence less effective. MGS5 asks, how far are you willing to go to deter players from raiding your base? Is the highest level of security and training enough? Or do you need to add a nuke to your arsenal? And what about other players with nukes? Are you against nukes to the point where you'll raid their bases to steal and dismantle their nukes? Metal Gear Solid 1, the promise of a nuclear strike from someone with nothing to lose. The health of your entire family is riding on you. Plus, you want to stick it to your deadbeat dad and prove that you're strong enough to make your mark on the world. That strength is what matters in the world, and you're strong enough to prove to the world that it should do things your way. The US government holds the key to life-saving genetic materials you could test to get the laundry list of diseases that may wipe out your family. They also have the funds to fund your dream of creating a place where you and your family are safe and in charge. How do you get what you need? Through a show of strength, of course. In Metal Gear Solid 1, Liquid wants the US to hand over Big Boss's body, $1 billion, and the vaccine to the Foxdie virus. He knows they wouldn't give these things to him as a gift, so he and his family of genome soldiers take over Shadow Moses, a weapons development complex masquerading as a nuclear weapons disposal facility, and threaten to launch a nuke via Metal Gear Rex, a bipedal, nuclear-capable tank. Threatening a nuclear strike drew the attention Liquid desired. What was the US's response though? Did they threaten a nuclear strike if he were to launch his nuke? Nuclear deterrence only works if both parties don't want to engage in a nuclear war. Liquid knew the US would be unwilling to launch a nuclear strike so long as he threatened them with a nuclear strike of his own. In this way, a nuclear deterrent worked. Liquid wasn't planning on keeping his threat just a threat though. He needed the US to know he was serious.
There's still no response from Washington. It looks like we'll have to show them that we mean business.
What would happen if Liquid launched his nuke? Would the US respond in kind? Would the US wait for things to get that dire before they launched a nuclear strike? Towards the end of MGS1, Snavit destroys Metal Gear Rex and thus destroys Liquid's only means to launch a nuke. Does disabling Liquid's nuclear capabilities lessen the tensions between him and the US? No. Secretary of Defense Jim Hausman ordered an aerial nuclear strike on Shadow Moses as soon as he learned of Metal Gear Rex's destruction. Liquid lost his nuclear deterrent and almost faced nuclear destruction because of it. Luckily, the best president ever, George Sears, was notified of the strike and cancelled it in the nick of time. Metal Gear Solid 1 seemingly proves that nuclear deterrence is necessary through the conflict with Liquid. As soon as Liquid lost his nuclear deterrent, he was almost nuked. I'd argue that this was the actions of one bad apple, though. Jim Hausman only got away with ordering the initial strike because of his title as Secretary of Defense, but his decision wasn't a popular one or supported by his colleagues, like Colonel Campbell or the President. Also, Liquid wasn't going for a nuclear deterrent since he fully planned on using his nuke. If nukes didn't exist and Shadow Moses wasn't secretly producing nukes, there wouldn't have been any nukes for Liquid to get his hands on. Double also, Snavit was able to take Liquid down as a single operative. They didn't need a nuke to take Liquid down. What do you think though? Do you think nuclear deterrence was working in MGS1? Or do you think the addition of nuclear weapons only complicated things in an already messy situation? We did a vote here on YouTube asking if nuclear deterrence worked in Metal Gear Solid, and y'all had me going there for a hot minute. At first, it looked like it was pretty unanimous that nuclear deterrence did work, but then it swung in the other direction, which was super interesting to watch. I'd love to hear arguments from both sides, so please let me know down below if you think deterrence works in Metal Gear Solid. Comatose712, love your name by the way, said, "Remember, it's the threat the nukes themselves pose that act as a deterrent, so you'd best believe that the US will do literally anything to avoid a nuclear war." Which really got me thinking, do nukes lose their punch when they're used? Have we elevated nukes to a mythical status in order to really drive home just how much everyone in the world wants to avoid using them? I'm not saying we should use nukes to diminish how terrifying they are, but it was an interesting thought to think about how the threat of nukes are really so terrifying. What do y'all think about nuclear deterrence? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for making it to the end of today's video. If you liked it, share it with someone who wants to know more about Metal Gear Solid lore. If you need more MGS content, check out my Patreon. I upload articles I write on upcoming videos or just thought pieces on MGS in general. Or join us in Discord. We're always talking about MGS. More importantly than that though, please take care of yourself and I'll catch you on the next one. Thank you.